Hey, this is Dr. Centeno, and this is episode 3 of the COVID Fact Fiction Show. It's an apolitical deep dive into what's going on each week with COVID-19, but looking at the facts, digging deep to see what's really going on, not what just is being reported in the media. So I always kind of start off with masks. We'll call this the July 29th edition because there's always something going on with masks. So you may have seen these videos in the media. They're kind of cool. This is one from FAU in Florida where they put some masks on a test dummy and it seems to show that things are better. And the media portrays this as definitively proving that masks work to reduce the spread of the virus. Now this is a cloth mask. As you can see, it's not working all that great here with a simulated cough. But that's generally how it's reported in the media, that these videos dramatically show and provide visual evidence that masks are effective. Again, before I get into this, I wear an N95 mask in the office all day. I wear masks every place else they tell me to go. So I have no problem wearing masks. It's just the science behind masks is not nearly as good as the media has been portraying. But when you watch these videos, realize that they do not show the 1 to 3 micron particles. You can't see these with the naked eye. Those are the particles everyone's concerned about because they hang in the air for a couple of hours. In addition, none of these studies show the infectivity of these particles, meaning can they infect somebody? And then the only study we have that tried to look at that actually tried to do it in a lab. And it found they could only really get coronavirus to culture out of 3 of 18 samples they took. So again, you're not seeing these 1 to 3 micron particles that are going right through that cloth mask, right through that surgical mask as that person breathes. And you've probably seen some quotes from the architect of Sweden's COVID-19 response, Anders Tegnell. But you probably really haven't seen the long version of an actual interview with him, which I watched this week. And the media, of course, continues to bash Sweden at every opportunity for opposing the media narrative. What I found interesting was that there was a nice interview with Anders Tegnell, and he's the guy who's driving this in Sweden. And he brought up some really interesting points because all you really tend to hear from this guy is a quote or two taken out of context. So if you watch the whole half-hour interview, what you hear him saying is that Sweden is very different demographically from its neighbors. Sweden's been compared to its neighbors with death rate, but he brought up it's actually more similar to the UK with lots and lots of immigrants. In addition to that, the way Sweden is categorizing mortality is different from its neighbors. So it was an interesting interview, and I definitely will leave a link to it in the show notes so you can go ahead and take a look at that. And what he said is judge me in a year. That seems pretty reasonable because by then we'll really know whether or not Sweden saved lives or is really the same as everyone else once this thing plays out. Now, interestingly, this week, the Financial Times has a nice story on Sweden showing that the Swedish companies beat their earnings expectations, unlike many other countries. And that makes sense, right? They didn't really have a shutdown. This is one that's really hard to hear as a parent. You know, I see these stories on kids and COVID, and they are heart-wrenching. There's no doubt that when you hear a 9-year-old died of COVID-19, I mean, that gets your attention. Again, it's a tragedy when a child dies. I can't imagine what the parents feel. But for the rest of us, it's critical to kind of look at how at risk our kids are or are not, because we're about to send them back to school, right? Or at least maybe kind of back to school somewhat. So how common is a death from coronavirus or COVID-19 in kids and young adults? Let's look at that. So this is the CDC data. So in all of the United States, through this year, age 5 to 14, only 16 kids died. Age 15 to 24, only 190 kids died. Now, we have to put that in perspective, right? We've got to see how many kids normally die each year from just lots of stuff. Well, that's this table. So you can see from 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and 15 to 24. Unintentional injuries in those three age groups, just injuries, those are likely car crashes and other things. About 14,000 kids die in these age groups every year. Look at suicide there in the 15 to 24-year-olds. So again, we had these three top categories. That's about 14,000. Suicide, 6,000 kids aged 15 to 24 per year. Homicide, 45 or 4,600 kids. Again, you add this all up and we're talking about tens of thousands of childhood deaths a year compared to those small numbers I showed you. So COVID-19 is not putting a dent in any childhood death rate right now. This is a scary article. 1/3 of COVID-19 patients who aren't hospitalized have a long-term illness. I read this, was like, oh my God, what's going on here? Obviously, I don't just read headlines, I go beneath it and look at the actual study. So this is the study they're talking about out of the CDC, and what did it really show? So this is the actual study and the results. So if you took sick people who needed to get a PCR test, that those people, about 1/3 of them still had symptoms at 2 to 3 weeks. Now, again, you have to realize that this is anywhere from 10 to 50 times less, because that's how many people get this virus and don't get sick and never get tested. And not so scary now, right? You really think about this, you're like, God, prior to the pandemic, we all knew someone personally who had a couple weeks of a really awful influenza or other virus, and they were in bed for a few weeks, and that stuff certainly happened. So again, given that for every symptomatic COVID patient, we have about 10 to 50 times as many out there who never got symptoms, we're only really talking here about 0.7 to 3% of patients who get infected with this virus who are in this category of having 2 to 3 weeks of symptoms of COVID-19. So this is an interesting one. This is experts urge shutdown as coronavirus deaths climb. Obviously, it's a CNN piece. It has to be for that level of exaggeration. And this is a public interest research group letter. There were some experts on it. There's a lot of some doctors, some nurses, there's some teachers on here. And what they're suggesting is that we got to shut it all down again hard for as long as it takes, months and months and months, because that way we can then hire 200,000 more contact tracers, and we can be like Taiwan or some of these places that beat this thing early. Not really going to work in actuality in the US because we're not set up to do this in any way, shape, or form. Remember, in Taiwan, if you left your house and were caught outside your house while you were in lockdown, when you weren't supposed to be, they actually took away your citizenship. That ain't happening here anytime soon. So this is kind of an impractical thing. But more importantly, whenever we see these urges to shut down the entire society again, we have to realize that the American Academy of Family Physicians estimates that 150,000 people will die deaths of despair, suicide, drug addiction, domestic violence, alcoholism, etc. And we're likely going to lose hundreds of thousands of people to late diagnosis and treatment of correctable but fatal problems. AFib, strokes. These are people who won't go near a hospital, who, if they did, could be saved and helped, but because they're not going to, hundreds of thousands of them will die. So we're going to lose hundreds of thousands of people either way, whether we stay open or shut down. This is a really interesting one. The article was interesting. Obviously, it's exaggerated. And there were two studies. One was a piece of junk, but I want to go over the one that isn't a piece of junk because it was kind of interesting here with regard to COVID-19 and heart damage. So this is the actual JAMA study this is based on. And the key findings. Now, again, all of this is diluted by the 10 to 50 times patients who get infected and have zero symptoms or very few symptoms, don't seek medical care at all. And 33% of these 100 patients were hospitalized, 66% recovered at home. And what's interesting is 71% of patients had a biomarker for heart damage. Now, again, here's the caveat. This was at a very low level for this particular biomarker of heart damage. And it was well below the abnormal range. So if you went to the hospital with heart pain or a chest pain and you got this test and it came back at a 3 or a 4 or a 5, they wouldn't do anything. They would say you don't have any heart issues. So you got to take this with a grain of salt. Only about 5% of these patients, and those were mostly hospitalized patients, had the higher abnormal levels. But it was interesting to see that there were some mild cardiac MRI findings here. So we need to pay attention to this. We need to look at this. Obviously, the media here exaggerated it beyond what it really is, but it's certainly something to look at as to whether or not people who don't get hospitalized are getting some mild amount of heart inflammation or damage. We won't know for a long time whether or not any of this is actually ongoing or it just resolves on its own. So the good news, I've given you all the bad news. Let's at least do a little good news like I always do. Interestingly, there were just a whole bunch of neutralizing antibodies found for coronavirus. And this is the actual study. These can kill coronavirus in the lab. We'll have to see if that works in people. But these can be mass produced, so that's good news. And another piece of good news is that the CDC just reduced the isolation period for those who test positive for COVID-19. And this is the publication. Basically, they took it from 14 days to 10 days of isolation if you test positive. And before you needed 2 positive tests, now there's no routine retest needed. So that's all very good news. And I'm going to leave you today with my Margaritaville rewrite. I was driving home yesterday from the Colorado mountains where it's pretty chill up there with regard to COVID. You have to wear masks and things, but when you're on the trails, it's pretty chill. And coming back down into Metro Denver that I now call Corona Cookieville. So you can see here how I've changed some words around, searching for my lost Corona mask. Some people claim that there's a Trump to blame, but I know it's nobody's fault. Again, for your edification, I'm not going to sing it. I don't want to torture you, but I thought it was interesting to do in the car while I was driving home for 2 hours. So thanks so much for watching the COVID Fact Fiction Show, episode 3. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. In addition to that, please share this with your friends. If you've got friends who are also just kind of fed up with the media narrative and would really like to see what's real underneath the covers, then please share this with them so they can watch as well. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.